Here's the scene. Our neighbor dialed 911 on my wife 4 times because her purse looked too tactical. Not because it was dangerous. Not because Grace did anything wrong. Just because it didn't fit this neighbor's vision of suburban perfection. But oh, she didn't stop there. Soon, we were dodging anonymous flyers, spotting binoculars, glinting behind curtains, and facing what I can only describe as a conspiracy board straight out of a late-night crime show obsessional over a bag. What unfolded next? Let's just say she picked the worst neighbor to wage her bizarre war against. Ever had someone size you up completely wrong based on nothing? I'm dying to hear your craziest neighbor tales in the comments. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontation with the HOA. Will narrate your story on our channel. I'm Lucas Graces, and my wife Grace and I thought we'd hit the jackpot moving into Willowbrook Valley, a postcard-perfect suburb where every lawn's pristine, every house screams magazine cover, and the HOA dictates everything from mailbox hues to grass height, down to the millimeter. We'd scraped together years of savings for this place, and with Grace landing her dream job nearby, it felt like the stars had aligned. But we had no clue our next-door neighbor was about to turn our fresh start into a full-blown nightmare. It was a sunny Saturday morning when we first crossed paths with Mara Westbrook. Grace and I were hauling boxes from the moving truck when this woman materialized at our driveway's edge, like she'd been staking us out. Mara, mid-40s, dressed to the nines at 9 a.m., flashed a smile that never touched her eyes. She introduced herself as the HOA president, claiming she wanted to welcome us. But the way she eyed Grace wasn't neighborly. It was like she was scanning for flaws, conducting a silent interrogation. "Do you too do for work?" Mara asked, her eyes scanning our belongings like she was taking inventory. Grace was pulling her every day purse out of the car, a simple cross-body bag she always wore. When Mara's expression suddenly changed, I watched as her eyes focused on the bag, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. The bag had a slightly rectangular bulge on one side that, if you didn't know what it was, might look suspicious to someone with an overactive imagination. "That's an interesting bag," Mara said, her voice taking on an edge. "What exactly do you carry in there? It looks heavy." And that shape, she pointed at Grace's purse like she'd discovered some kind of smoking gun. Grace, being the professional she is, just smiled politely and said, "Oh, just the usual stuff, you know how it is." But Marlo wasn't satisfied with that answer. She stepped closer, squinting at the bag like she was trying to see through the leather. "It looks like you might be carrying something dangerous," she said, her voice getting louder, "something that could be a threat to our safe neighborhood." That's when I realized this woman wasn't just nosy, she was paranoid, and she'd already decided that Grace was some kind of threat based on absolutely nothing. But the shape of her purse, Grace tried to change the subject, asking Mara about the neighborhood and the HOA rules. But our new neighbor was fixated on that bag. She kept circling back to it, making comments about safety and knowing your neighbors, and being careful about who you let into your community. Finally, she stepped back and gave us both a look that was equal parts suspicion and determination. "You know," she said, "my late husband was a police officer. He taught me to recognize certain things, certain shapes, and I always trust my instincts when it comes to protecting this neighborhood." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just an overly curious neighbor. This was someone with a mission, and she'd apparently decided that Grace was her target. As Marlowe walked back to her house, she turned around one more time and called out, "Welcome to Willowbrook Valley. I hope everyone here stays safe." The emphasis she put on everyone and safe made it clear that she considered Grace a potential threat to that safety. I looked at Grace, who was still standing there with that professional calm she'd perfected over years of dealing with difficult people, and I knew we were in for trouble. Within 24 hours of our first encounter, it became crystal clear that Mara Westbrook had appointed herself as our personal surveillance team. I first noticed her watching us on Sunday morning when I was in our kitchen making coffee. I happened to glance out the window and saw her standing at her own kitchen window with what looked like a pair of binoculars pointed directly at our house. When she realized I'd spotted her, she quickly stepped back and closed her curtains, but the message was clear: we were being watched. She moved with the obsession of a wannabe spy on a caffeine bender. Bedroom blinds at sunrise, kitchen drapes by lunch, binoculars always ready. One neighbor joked she had more camera angles than a reality show. My security camera captured it all, and watching the footage later was like seeing someone audition for a suburban thriller that nobody asked for. The woman had turned surveillance into performance art, complete with costume changes and strategic positioning. By Monday afternoon, Grace showed me an email that had been forwarded to her by one of our other neighbors. But Mara wasn't content with just watching. First came the email full of concerned citizen language. Then came the flyer, anonymous, but only in the legal sense. Both warned neighbors about a suspicious newcomer with a concealed threat in her bag. You'd think Grace was smuggling plutonium, not a wallet and lip balm. I read that email 3 times, getting angrier. Each time this woman was essentially telling our neighbors that we were dangerous based on nothing but her paranoid assumptions about Grace's purse. But Grace, true to form, just shook her head and said let her dig her own hole. Lucas, sometimes the best strategy is to let people reveal who they really are. Still, I decided I wasn't going to sit back and let this woman destroy our reputation in the neighborhood before we'd even unpacked our boxes. I quietly set up a small security camera in our front window, angled so it would capture any unusual activity from Mara's direction. Betty Collins knocked on our door Tuesday evening with a troubled expression and a handful of photocopied flyers. I found this in my mailbox, she said, holding up what looked like a neighborhood watch bulletin. And so did the Hendersons, the Millers, and probably everyone else on the block. The flyer even included a crude diagram showing the typical concealment methods used by criminals to hide firearms in residential areas. It was like something out of a Cold War propaganda handbook, except instead of communists, the threat was apparently my wife's purse. She's not just watching you anymore, Betty said quietly. She's actively trying to turn the entire neighborhood against you. The Hendersons asked me if I'd seen anything suspicious about you. To the Millers wanted to know if they should be worried about their kids playing in their front yard. Betty shook her head in disgust. I told them both that you seemed like perfectly normal people, but Mara's got some folks genuinely scared. That evening Grace and I sat on our back patio and watched as Mara positioned herself at yet another window, binoculars in hand, trying to spy on us. She's getting desperate. Grace observed people like this usually escalate when their initial tactics don't work. First surveillance, then propaganda. Then what? As if to prove Grace's point, we watched Mara pull out her phone and start making another call. all while keeping those binoculars trained on our house. The breaking point came Wednesday morning when I caught Mara Red Ham doing something that crossed every line of decency and legality. I was getting ready for work when I saw movement in our front yard through the bedroom window. Mara was actually on our property, crouched behind our mailbox, apparently trying to see into our garage windows. She had a camera in her hands and was taking pictures of our house from multiple angles, like she was documenting evidence for some kind of investigation. I grabbed my phone and started recording her through the window, knowing I'd need proof of this trespassing if things escalated. Further, Mara spent nearly 10 minutes skulking around our property, taking photos, and even trying to peer through our front windows when she finally noticed another neighbor walking their dog down the street. She quickly scurried back to her own house, but not before I'd captured the entire incident on video. That's when Grace made a decision that would change everything. I think it's time to let Mara dig herself a little deeper hole. She said, "Tomorrow I'm going to wear my work clothes home. Let's see what happens when she gets a better look at what she thinks she's been seeing." The way Grace said it, with that calm confidence I'd learned to recognize over the years, told me that our neighbor was about to find out exactly who she'd been harassing for the past week. Tuesday morning started like any other day, except Grace had decided to wear a brown blazer to work. It was a perfectly normal professional look jacket, but apparently the color was close enough to a police uniform that it triggered something in Mara's already paranoid mind. I was watching from our kitchen window when Grace walked out to her car, and I saw Mara practically sprint to her own window. When she spotted Grace's outfit, even from a distance, I could see Mara getting agitated, pointing at Grace and talking to herself, like she'd just cracked some kind of case. Within an hour of Grace leaving for work, I watched through my security camera as Mara paced back and forth in her front yard, phone pressed to her ear. She was gesturing wildly with her free hand, and based on her body language, she was either very excited or very upset about something. It didn't take long to figure out what that phone call was about. Around lunchtime, Betty Collins called me with some interesting news, Lucas. She said, "I thought you should know that Mara called the police this morning. She told them she suspected your wife of impersonating a police officer." I have to admit, I laughed out loud when Betty told me that the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But of course, Betty didn't know why I found it so amusing. Did they take her seriously? I asked. Betty said that from what she could tell, the police had taken Mara's report, but explained that without any actual evidence of wrongdoing, there wasn't much they could do. They told her that wearing brown clothing isn't illegal, Betty said, and that she'd need to provide some kind of proof if she wanted them to investigate further. That's when Mara decided to become what she apparently considered a security expert. Her front window had become a control room laptop, sticky notes, security footage, and what might generously be called evidence, but looked more like a Pinterest board made by paranoia itself. Photos of Grace, arrows, red circles. It was less investigation, more obsession. I could see her through her window, reviewing footage from her own security system and taking screenshots, like she was analyzing evidence for a criminal case. Around 3 o'clock, I captured footage of Mara standing in her driveway with her phone, but this time she wasn't making a call. She was recording her own video, pointing at our house and talking to her phone's camera like she was some kind of investigative reporter breaking a Major story. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her gestures and facial expressions suggested she thought she was exposing the crime of the century. The situation took an even more bizarre turn when Betty knocked on our door that evening with news that made my blood boil. Mara invited me over to see what she calls her evidence, Betty said, shaking her head in disbelief. She's got charts, Lucas, actual charts, showing what time Grace leaves the house, what time she comes home, what she's wearing, what she's carrying. She's even got a color-coded system for rating how suspicious each activity is. Betty went on to describe what sounded like something out of a conspiracy theorist fever dream. She keeps calling herself a trained observer because her husband was a police officer. Betty explained she wanted me to sign some kind of statement saying I had observed suspicious activities at your house. When I told her I hadn't seen anything suspicious, she got angry and said I wasn't taking the threat seriously. She actually accused me of being naive about the dangers. In our own neighborhood that evening, Grace and I sat on our back patio and discussed Mara's escalating behavior. She's not just paranoid anymore, Grace observed. She's systematically building a case based on completely fabricated evidence. This is the kind of behavior that gets restraining orders issued. Grace was right, and we both knew that. Mara's amateur detective work was about to take an even more dangerous turn. Sure enough, Friday morning brought the sound of a police siren in our neighborhood, and I had a sinking feeling that Mara had finally convinced someone to take her investigation seriously. As I watched through my security camera, I realized that our paranoid neighbor was about to learn the difference between playing detective and dealing with real law enforcement. And based on Grace's calm smile when she heard the siren, I suspected Marlo was in for the education of her lifetime. When Grace got home that evening, I showed her the footage I'd been collecting, and she watched it with the kind of detached professional interest that told me she'd dealt with people like Marlo before. She called the police again, Grace asked, and when I confirmed it, she just nodded like she'd been expecting it. She said that's actually going to work in our favor later. I asked her what she meant, but Grace just smiled and said, "You'll see, but for now, let's just keep documenting everything she does." The next morning, Betty knocked on our door again, this time looking more concerned than before. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," she said, "but Mara called me last night asking if I'd be willing to sign some kind of petition about you two. She's trying to get other neighbors to complain to the HOA about your wife being a security threat to the neighborhood." Betty assured us that she'd refused to sign anything, but the fact that Marlo was now trying to turn our neighbors against us showed just how far she was willing to go with her baseless accusations. That's when Grace made a decision that would change everything. "I think it's time to let Mara dig herself a little deeper hole," she said. "Tomorrow, I'm going to wear my work clothes home. Let's see what happens when she gets a better look at what she thinks she's been seeing." The way Grace said it with that calm confidence I'd learned to recognize over the years told me that our neighbor was about to find out exactly who she'd been harassing for the past week. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you want to spend the day outside, but I had a feeling we were going to be dealing with indoor drama. Instead, Grace had decided to wear her work clothes home for the first time since we'd moved in, and I knew that was going to send Mara completely over the edge. Grace's actual work attire was professional but unmistakably official looking, and when she walked out to her car that morning, I positioned myself at the kitchen window to watch. The show Mara didn't disappoint. The moment Grace stepped outside, I saw our neighbor practically flatten herself against her front window, those binoculars glued to her face. From my angle, I could see Rosa's mouth moving rapidly like she was talking to herself, or maybe recording another one of her amateur detective videos. Grace, for her part, moved with the kind of calm, confident posture that comes from years of professional training, completely ignoring the fact that she was being watched by our increasingly unhinged neighbor. About an hour after Grace left for work, I watched through my security camera as Mara burst out of her front door like her house was on fire. She was waving her phone around and pacing in circles on her front lawn, clearly agitated about something. This wasn't the careful, calculated surveillance I'd been documenting for the past week. This was pure panic, and I had a sinking feeling that she'd finally decided to take her paranoid theories to the next level. My suspicions were confirmed around noon when I heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren in the distance, getting closer to our neighborhood. I stepped out onto my front porch just as a squad car turned onto our street, and I wasn't surprised to see it slow down as it approached our house. What did surprise me was seeing Mara practically sprinting across her yard to intercept the officer before he could even get out of his car. The police officer who emerged from the vehicle looked like he was in his mid-20s, with the kind of professional demeanor that suggested he dealt with his share of neighborhood disputes. Mara immediately launched into what appeared to be a detailed explanation of her concerns, pointing at our house and gesturing wildly with her hands. I could only catch fragments of what she was saying, but I heard the words dangerous weapon and impersonating several times. Jake Miller, according to his name tag, listened patiently to Mara's excited explanation. Before walking over to our front door, I invited him in and offered him a cup of coffee, which he politely declined. Sir, he said, I've received a report about possible illegal weapons on the premises and someone potentially impersonating a police officer. I'm required to investigate these claims, though I have to say the complainant seems unusually agitated. I told Jake Miller that my wife wasn't home, but that I'd be happy to answer any questions he had. That's when things took an interesting turn. What's your wife's name? He asked, pulling out a small notebook. When I told him Grace's, I watched his expression change from professional politeness to something that looked like surprise, then confusion, then what might have been amusement. Grace's, he repeated, and when I confirmed it, he asked about 5'6". Brown hair, usually wears a cross body bag. I nodded, wondering where this was going. Jake Miller closed his notebook and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He blinked. Mr. Grace's, I think your neighbor's been trying to get our new police chief arrested. The grin he tried to suppress said it. All the pieces clicked together like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. All those morning runs where Grace moved with military precision, the confident posture that never wavered even under Mara's intense scrutiny, the calm warnings about legal consequences that weren't threats but professional observations. I should have known Grace wasn't hiding from anything. She was just waiting for the right moment to let the truth hit like a freight train. Jake Miller explained that he'd worked with Grace briefly in Austin before transferring to Willowbrook Valley, and that she'd been hired as the new police chief, but hadn't officially started yet. She's supposed to begin on Monday, he said. I knew she lived in this neighborhood, but I didn't realize she was the dangerous woman with a weapon that's been reported to us multiple times this week. While we were talking inside, I could see Mara through the window, standing at the edge of our driveway, like a guard dog, clearly expecting to watch Grace get arrested at any moment. Jake Miller noticed her too and shook his head. That woman has called us 4 times in the past week, he said. We've been trying to be patient because she mentioned losing her husband, but this is getting out of hand. When Jake Miller finally left our house, I watched as he walked over to where Marlo was waiting, even from a distance. I could see her getting more and more agitated as their conversation continued. She kept pointing at our house and making gestures that suggested she couldn't understand why Grace wasn't being dragged away in handcuffs. Finally, Jake Miller got back in his car and drove away, leaving Mara standing alone in our driveway, looking completely bewildered within minutes of the police car disappearing around the corner. Marlo was marching up to our front door like a woman on a mission. She pounded on the door with enough force to rattle the frame, and when I opened it, she was practically vibrating with indignation. "What did you tell that officer?" she demanded. "Why didn't he arrest your wife? What kind of hold do you people have over the police department?" I looked at this woman who had spent the past week making our lives miserable based on nothing but her own paranoid assumptions, and I decided it was time to start enjoying the situation. "Mara," I said calmly, "what makes you think my wife should be arrested?" She sputtered for a moment before launching into a detailed explanation of all the evidence she'd gathered: the suspicious bag, the brown clothing, the shifty behavior, and what she was convinced was some kind of fake police uniform. "Your wife is obviously some kind of criminal," Marla declared with absolute certainty, "and she's corrupted the police somehow. But I'm not giving up. I'm going to call the state police, the FBI if I have to. I'm going to expose whatever scam you people are running." The irony was so perfect that I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost, Mara," I said, still maintaining that calm tone. "I think you might want to be careful about making accusations you can't prove." But she was already stalking back to her house, muttering about corruption and cover-ups, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to become the subject of her own investigation. Sunday morning brought what I can only describe as the calm before the storm. Grace had returned from her Saturday shift in a surprisingly good I wasn't quite seeing yet. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," was all she said, but the way she said camera footage, 2 weeks of recording Mara's surveillance activities, had given me quite a collection of material. Her standing at various windows with binoculars, taking pictures of our house, walking through our yard, and that classic shot of her pacing around her front lawn while making frantic phone calls. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the video yet, but something told me it might come in handy soon. Around lunchtime, Grace suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood to meet more of our neighbors. This seemed like an innocent enough idea until I realized that Grace was steering our route to take us past every house in our section of Willowbrook Valley. At each stop, she introduced herself with the kind of professional friendliness that put people immediately at ease, and somehow the subject of Mara's recent behavior came up in every conversation. We didn't knock on every door. Most doors opened before we even reached the porch. Everyone had a story. A single mom accused of neglect because she worked night shifts, a retired vet accused of drug trafficking because of his medical deliveries, a young mechanic labeled a criminal for changing his own brake pads in his garage. Each story followed the same pattern. Marlo would decide some perfectly normal behavior was suspicious, launch a surveillance campaign, try to turn neighbors against the target, then involve the police with increasingly frantic reports. Grace wasn't shocked by what we heard. She was furious, the kind of quiet fury I'd only seen when she testified against stalkers in court. "This ends now," she said as we walked back toward our house, her jaw set in that way that meant someone was about to face the full weight of the law. "Mara Westbrook has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years because nobody has been willing or able to stop her. Well, that's about to change." That afternoon, Grace sat down at her laptop and composed what she later described as an educational email. She sent it to the same neighborhood distribution list that Mara had been using for her safety alerts. But Grace's message had a very different tone. "Dear neighbors," it began, "I wanted to address some recent concerns that have been raised about my family and me. While I appreciate everyone's commitment to neighborhood safety, I think it's important that we all understand the legal implications of making false reports to law enforcement." Grace's email went on to explain in terms that anyone could understand exactly what constitutes a false police report, what the penalties were under Texas law, and how repeated false reporting could be considered harassment. She didn't mention Mara by name, but anyone who had been following the drama of the past 2 weeks would know exactly who the email was aimed at. "I encourage everyone to report genuine safety concerns," Grace concluded, "but I also encourage everyone to be certain of their facts before involving law enforcement. False reports waste valuable police resources and can have serious legal consequences for the person making the report." The response to Grace's email was immediate and overwhelming. Our neighbors started replying with their own stories about Mara's behavior, many of them apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Several people mentioned that they'd been afraid to challenge Mara because of her connections to the local police department through her late husband. But Grace's email seemed to give them permission to finally voice their frustrations. By Sunday evening, it was clear that the neighborhood dynamics had shifted dramatically. Mara, who had spent years terrorizing her neighbors with impunity, suddenly found herself isolated and defensive. I watched through my security camera as she stood at her front window, apparently reading the flood of email responses on her phone, and I could see her getting more agitated with each message. Monday morning was when everything came to a head. Grace left for her first official day as police chief, wearing her full uniform for the first time since we'd moved to Willowbrook Valley. As she walked out to her car, I positioned myself at the window to watch Mara's reaction, and it was even better than I'd hoped. Mara took one look at Grace in that official police uniform and completely lost her mind. I watched as Mara burst out of her house and ran toward Grace, shouting something about fake uniforms and impersonating officers. Grace calmly turned to face her, and even from a distance, I could see that professional, authoritative posture that I'd learned to recognize over the years. Whatever Grace said to Mara, it was brief and to the point, but it was enough to stop our neighbor mid-rant. Then the most beautiful thing happened. A police cruiser pulled up to our curb, and Jake Miller got out with a smile and a wave. "Good morning, Chief," he called out loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "Ready for your first day?" Grace smiled back and replied, "Absolutely, Jake. Let's go make sure our community stays safe." I will never forget the look on Mara's face at that moment. It was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse in real time. The dangerous criminal she'd been reporting to the police for 2 weeks was not only a police officer herself, but she was the chief of police, the boss of every officer Mara had been calling with her paranoid theories. The irony was so perfect that it almost seemed scripted, but the look of absolute horror and embarrassment on Mara's face was completely genuine as Grace got into the police cruiser and Jake Miller drove her away to start her first day as chief. I watched Mara slowly walk back to her house like someone in a daze. She kept looking back at our house, then at the spot where the police car had been, like she was trying to process what had just happened. And that was just the beginning of what turned out to be the longest day of Marlo Westbrook's life. By Monday afternoon, word had spread through Willowbrook Valley faster than a grass fire. In August, the woman who had been calling the police to report our dangerous neighbor had actually been reporting the new police chief. The irony was so delicious that I could practically taste it, but Mara was apparently not finding the situation quite as amusing as the rest of us were. I first realized that Mara was having a complete breakdown when I heard shouting coming from her front yard around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I looked out my window to see her pacing back and forth on her lawn, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly with her free hand. From the fragments I could hear she was calling someone and demanding that they do something about the conspiracy in our neighborhood. Eddie Collins called me an hour later with some interesting intelligence. Lucas, she said, I think you should know that Mara has been calling everyone she can think of, trying to get someone to investigate your wife. She called the county sheriff, the state police, and from what I heard through the grapevine, she even tried to call the FBI. Betty paused before adding, the problem is, everyone she's calling already knows that Grace is the new police chief. Word travels fast in law enforcement circles. That evening, the neighborhood email chain that had been relatively quiet since Grace's educational message on Sunday suddenly exploded with activity. Mara had sent out what could only be described as a manifesto claiming that Grace's appointment as police chief was part of some elaborate cover-up designed to hide her criminal activities. The email was rambling, paranoid, and so completely detached from reality that several neighbors forwarded it to me with messages like, is she serious? And should we be worried about her mental state? Tuesday brought an escalation that nobody saw coming. I was working in my home office when I heard a commotion outside and looked out to see Mara standing in the middle of our street, literally stopping cars and trying to warn people about the corruption in our neighborhood. She was carrying a folder full of printed papers, which I assumed were her evidence against Grace, and she was approaching anyone who would listen with the fervor of a street preacher. The situation got so disruptive that someone called the police, and I watched from my window as Jake Miller and another officer arrived to deal with Mara's public disturbance. The conversation between Mara and the officers was too far away for me to hear clearly, but based on Mara's increasingly animated gestures and the officer's patient but firm body language, it was clear that she was not taking their advice. Well, that's when Mara made the decision that would ultimately seal her fate, according to Betty, who witnessed the entire thing from her front porch. Mara demanded that the officers arrest Grace for fraud and conspiracy, and when they explained that Grace was their boss and had done nothing wrong, Mara accused them of being part of the cover-up. She then announced that she was going to drive to the police station and demand to speak to someone higher up the chain of command. The problem with Mara's plan, of course, was that Grace was the highest-ranking law enforcement official in Willowbrook Valley. When Mara marched into the police station demanding to speak to whoever is in charge, she was directed to Chief Grace. Grace's office. I can only imagine the look on her face when she realized that the criminal she wanted to report was sitting behind the chief's desk wearing the uniform she'd spent 2 weeks claiming was fake. Grace told me later that the conversation was brief and professional. She listened to Mara's accusations, reviewed the documented evidence of Mara's harassment campaign, and then explained the legal consequences of filing false police reports and engaging in targeted harassment of a neighbor. I gave her one warning. Grace said I told her that any further harassment would result in formal charges being filed against her. But Mara apparently wasn't done fighting. Wednesday morning brought news that she had called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she was calling a serious security threat to our community. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and according to the notice that went out to all residents, Mara intended to present evidence of criminal activity and corruption and call for Grace and me to be removed from the neighborhood for the safety of all residents. I have to admit, I was actually looking forward to that meeting after 2 weeks of dealing with Mara's paranoid accusations and watching her terrorize our neighbors with her conspiracy theories. I was ready to see how she was going to explain her behavior to a room full of people who now knew the truth about Grace's identity and Mara's pattern of harassment. Thursday evening arrived with all the anticipation of a championship boxing match. The community center was packed with more residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting, and everyone seemed to be buzzing with excitement about what was about to unfold. Grace and I arrived a few minutes early and took seats in the back row where we had a clear view of the entire room. When Mara walked in carrying a box full of what I assumed were her evidence files, the room went almost completely silent. She looked haggarded and stressed, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well, and she kept glancing around the room like she was expecting to be ambushed. She set up her materials at the front of the room and called the meeting to order with the kind of forced authority that only made her appear more desperate. "Thank you all for coming," Mara began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've called this meeting because our neighborhood is facing a serious threat and the authorities have been compromised. I have evidence that proves our new neighbors are not who they claim to be and that local law enforcement has been corrupted to cover up their crimes." The room remained silent as Mara launched into a presentation that was equal parts paranoid fantasy and character assassination. She showed pictures she'd taken of Grace carrying her purse, claiming they were proof of illegal weapons. She displayed screenshots of Grace's professional emails, arguing that the legal language proved she was trying to intimidate honest citizens. Most bizarrely, she presented a timeline of Grace's daily activities, complete with timestamps and detailed notes as evidence of suspicious behavior patterns. But the moment that defined the entire meeting came when Mara pointed directly at Grace and declared, "This woman has been impersonating a police officer to avoid investigation, and she's corrupted our local police department to protect her criminal enterprise." The silence in the room was deafening, and I could see several of our neighbors looking back and forth between Mara and Grace with expressions of pure disbelief. That's when Grace stood up, and the authority in her posture was unmistakable. "Mrs. Westbrook," she said in a calm, professional voice that carried clearly through the entire room, "I am Chief Grace Graces of the Willowbrook Valley Police Department. I have not been impersonating a police officer. I am a police officer, and I am the highest-ranking law enforcement official in this community. Your accusations are not only false, they constitute harassment and defamation, and they end tonight." The silence that followed Grace's announcement was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop in that packed community center. I watched as Mara's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, the dawning realization that she had just publicly accused the chief of police of being a criminal in front of half the neighborhood. "That's impossible," Marlowe whispered, but her voice carried in the silent room. "You're lying. This is part of the cover-up." She turned to face the audience, her voice getting louder and more desperate. "Don't you see? They've gotten to everyone. The police, the city government, probably the HOA board. To this is exactly what I've been trying to warn you about." Betty Collins stood up from her seat. In the third row, and at 70-some years old, she commanded attention. "Just by the way she carried herself, Mara," she said firmly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've watched you do this too for different families. You destroyed the Johnsons' peace of mind, you harassed the Martinezes until they moved away, and you've made life miserable for anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of acceptable neighbors. This stops now." One by one, other neighbors began standing up and sharing their own stories about Mara's behavior. The single mother who worked night shifts talked about how Mara had called Child Protective Services, claiming she was neglecting her children. The elderly man with medical deliveries described how Mara had convinced his pharmacy that he was selling his medications illegally. The young couple with the garage workshop explained how Mara had reported them to the city for running an unlicensed business, forcing them to prove that working on their own car in their own garage was legal. As each story was told, I watched Mara shrinking smaller and smaller in her chair at the front of the room. The pattern was undeniable. For years, she had been using her position as HOA president and her late husband's reputation in law enforcement to terrorize anyone who didn't meet her paranoid standards of normalcy. But this time, she had picked the wrong target. Grace listened to each neighbor's story with the kind of professional attention that made it clear she was taking notes for more than just personal interest. When the testimonies finally ended, she stood up again and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you've described tonight is a clear pattern of harassment that violates both HOA regulations and local ordinances. Mrs. Westbrook has filed at least 6 false police reports in the past 2 weeks alone, and based on what I've heard tonight, this appears to be part of a much larger pattern of behavior." The HOA board, which had been silent throughout the entire meeting, huddled together for a whispered conference before the board president stood up. "Mrs. Westbrook," he said, "in light of tonight's revelations and the testimony we've heard from multiple residents, the board has no choice but to immediately suspend you from your position as HOA president, pending a full investigation into your conduct." Mara's response was to launch into a final, desperate rant about conspiracies and cover-ups, but by that point she had lost whatever credibility she might have had left. Several neighbors were recording her outburst on their phones, and I could see that she was only making things worse for herself with every word she spoke. Her voice cracked as she accused Grace of orchestrating an elaborate scheme to infiltrate and control. In embarrassment, the meeting ended with a formal vote to remove Mara from all HOA positions and to ban her from filing any further complaints. As the neighborhood's liaison to law enforcement, a position that would help prevent future harassment campaigns like the one Mara had been running over the next few days. Surveillance and complaints. People seemed more relaxed, and friendly neighbors who had been afraid to spend time in their own yards were suddenly out working in their gardens and chatting over fence lines. The atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that Mara had cultivated for years evaporated almost overnight. Children played freely again. Couples took evening walks without feeling watched, and the community began to heal from years of unnecessary tension. As for Mara herself, she received an official warning from the police department about filing false reports, and she was required to attend counseling sessions to address what Grace diplomatically referred to as her difficulty adjusting to neighborhood life. She also received a formal cease and desist letter regarding any further harassment of neighbors, with the understanding that violations would result in criminal charges. No longer be tolerated. The most satisfying moment came a week later, when Grace and I were working in our front yard and saw a moving truck pull up to Mora's house, unable to face the embarrassment of her very public downfall, and probably unable to tolerate living next door to the police chief she had spent 2 weeks trying to have arrested. Mara had decided to relocate to a neighborhood where nobody knew about her conspiracy theories and false accusation. We watched in silence as her belongings were loaded into the truck, including what looked like several boxes of surveillance equipment and printed evidence files. As we watched her belongings being loaded into the truck, Grace turned to me with that same calm smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. "You know," she said, "I've dealt with a lot of difficult people in my career, but I've never had someone work so hard to investigate themselves into legal trouble." I laughed and wrapped my arm around my wife. The police chief, who had turned our paranoid neighbors' harassment campaign into a masterclass in how justice sometimes comes with a side of perfectly ironic karma. The last I heard, Mara was explaining to her new neighbors in her new city about the corruption she had exposed in Willowbrook Valley. "I wonder how long it will take them to figure out what we learned the hard way sometimes. And sometimes the person you're trying to get arrested is the one with the authority to arrest you right back now." Whenever I tell this story, people always ask me what the moral is. I tell them it's simple. Before you decide someone is dangerous based on what they're carrying in their bag, maybe you should find out who they really are, because you never know when that suspicious neighbor might turn out to be the chief of police. And trust me, that's a mistake you only want to make once the neighborhood has been peaceful ever since, and Grace has become something